Okay, today we are doing a Q&A about backpacking quilts. First, let's talk about the difference between a quilt and a normal mummy sleeping bag. Okay, go. So right here I have a normal mummy backpacking bag. It's filled with down, has a full-length zipper. So one of the main features of a mummy bag and what makes it such a good performing piece of equipment is that it has the shape approximately of the human body. So it's narrow down at the foot end, it's wider at the shoulders, and it has a nice enclosed hood that can cinch around you. So the idea is that a mummy bag is designed to give you the most efficient way to insulate your body on a cold night. The downside to a mummy bag is that because they are narrow, they feel confining and it's hard to roll around without getting twisted up inside them, and there's just not a lot of room, especially for side sleepers or people who like to sprawl out quite a bit. Now you can get mummy bags that have a wider girth, but as you do that, they become less heat efficient and you end up spending more weight on comfort in terms of width instead of the insulation efficiency of the bag. The other thing with mummy bags is that you have insulation going all the way around the bag. There's insulation on the bottom, there's insulation on the sides, there's insulation over the top of you, and there's insulation in the hood. Okay, so now let's go through the salient features of a quilt. So here I have a quilt, and the quilt is now turned upside down. So what you're looking at is the bottom, and you can see here that there's this big cutout section where there's no insulation on the bottom. The idea behind this is that when you're in a sleeping bag, you're compressing that insulation anyways, and so it's not really doing its job of insulating you. The primary thing that insulates the bottom of your body, of course, is your sleeping pad. So the theory is that if you cut out the bottom of the sleeping bag, you end up with a quilt and it becomes a lighter sleeping bag. The other thing with a quilt is that they don't have a hood. And the idea is that you're combining the quilt with clothing you're already carrying as part of your sleep system. So most of us are carrying a synthetic or down puffy insulated jacket, which we then can wear to bed at night as part of our sleep system. Now, because the bag does not have a hood, we can wear a hat to bed or use the hood of the jacket to insulate our head at night. Now we have a 30-degree quilt here today. Now if we were to take a similarly designed 30-degree sleeping bag, cut a big hole out of the bottom like this, chop off the hood, we would probably take the weight of that bag from about 26, 27 ounces down to the 18, 19, 20 ounce range. And that's exactly where this quilt falls in, 19 ounces, and it has a 30-degree temperature rating, which corresponds to a couple of inches of single layer loft. So we've talked about the main design feature of a quilt is that it's bottomless, thus saving weight and capitalizing instead on the insulating ability of your sleeping pad to keep you warm at night. However, if that's the main performance feature you think a quilt offers, then I think you're underselling the benefits of a quilt. The thing I like about quilts the most is that it's a variable girth sleeping bag. That means you can adjust the girth of the quilt by narrowing it on cold nights like you would have in a normal mummy bag as it is, and expanding it on warm nights, leaving you with more room to move around, sleep on your side, and in general not sleep so warm. And the way that it accomplishes this is through some type of pad attachment system that attaches to your sleeping pad and keeps the quilt affixed to that pad. And then you can use some type of toggle or adjustable buckle, and that's what allows you to adjust the girth of the quilt. The pad attachment system also allows the quilt to keep drafts out so that cold air doesn't enter the quilt through the open bottom, and it keeps your body warmth in. Since the quilt is a hoodless design, it usually comes with some type of snap closure at the neck and cinch draw cord to seal around the neck. Okay, with that, let's get right into the questions that were submitted to our solicitation on social media. Dodge Gary from YouTube writes, can you use them in temperatures below 35 degrees Fahrenheit? The coldest I've ever used a quilt was at 27 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. I don't recommend that. I'd recommend a winter expedition class mummy sleeping bag. However, I was experimenting and I was trying to figure out how can you do this if you absolutely needed to? And I was doing all sorts of crazy stuff. I had a couple of sleeping pads, vapor barrier clothing, a winter parka, a winter insulated down pants, down mitts, down booties, and finally a bivy sack. I did sleep out under the stars. There was no wind, but it was a challenging night nonetheless. I was using a 10-degree rated quilt, and combined with all that other clothing, I actually remained comfortable for about 6 to 8 hours, but after that I had to get up. I was pretty chilly. That doesn't mean I recommend quilts for winter camping, but using a quilt at 35 degrees Fahrenheit or less, absolutely. It really depends on 3 things. 1, the ability for you to have a pad attachment system that seals the quilt effectively to the sleeping pad so you don't get drafts coming in and out. 2nd, that you have a quilt that has sufficient loft to keep you warm in those conditions. So like I said, this quilt has about 2 inches of loft and it's rated at approximately 30 degrees. If I was looking for a quilt that was rated at 20 degrees, I would be looking at 2.5 to 3 inches of loft. And the 3rd thing is that you have the right supplemental clothing, especially something on the head like a balaclava or a down hood or an insulated jacket hood that keeps heat from escaping around the neck opening of the quilt. And that segues into the next question from YouTube from Digital Smitty, who asks, how accurate is the temperature rating? On a traditional mummy bag, 2 inches of single layer loft is going to be a 20 to 25 degree sleeping bag. On a quilt, 2 inches of single layer loft is going to be a little bit higher than that. So figure on about a 30-degree temperature rating. The reason is that because you have less opportunity to entrap heat inside the quilt because of the lack of a hood and of course the potential for heat loss through the open bottom. Unfortunately, many quilt manufacturers still adhere to the same rules of thumb for estimating sleeping bag ratings, and then they apply that to their quilts. So some of these quilts out there I don't think are rated very accurately. So more importantly, look for the amount of loft in the quilt and look for the amount of down fill in the quilt. That will give you a much better idea of how to compare various quilts than the manufacturer's reported temperature rating. We had a number of related questions about the next topic. Section Hiking the AT from YouTube asks, how do you prevent those little ice cold blasts of air when you roll over? Winged One from Instagram writes, how does one manage the use of a quilt below 20 degrees without drafts if you are, for example, a human rotisserie? And Dan from Instagram writes, how to combat drafts. No matter how I attach my straps, every time I roll over, my backside is hanging out. Smooth Dave from Instagram writes, I catch a cold draft under my quilt when I roll over. How do you prevent that from happening? Okay, the answer to all those questions, it's in the pad attachment system. So let's look at the pad attachment system for the REI Magma quilt. If you want more details about this particular one, check out the review we just published on that. I'll link it up here as well as in the video description. Okay, this quilt includes a loop of shoestring webbing that is adjustable in size with a toggle. So you basically adjust the width of that loop with the toggle so that it fits tightly around your sleeping pad. So to do this, the first thing we're going to do is turn the sleeping pad over, slide the loop over it, and tighten that draw cord toggle until it's nice and tight. And then what I'll do is tie a square knot on top of that toggle so it doesn't slip and stays into place. Now most quilts ship with 2 straps or loops, so you'll want to do this for both the lower and the upper strap as well. So I'll flip the sleeping pad over, and now you can see that there are 2 toggles attached to the draw cord. These toggles then attach to loops on the quilt itself. So let's look at that. Okay, so now we have this little nylon loop that's attached to the sleeping bag, and we're going to slide that over the toggle. And there's going to be another one on the opposite edge of the sleeping bag, and we'll slide that one over the toggle on the other side of the loop. Okay, and now we have the edges of the quilt affixed to this cord that lies on the sleeping pad. And you can see that the quilt's edge is rolled under the sleeping pad, and that is what allows you to control drafts coming in and out of the quilt during cold weather. Now, an effective pad attachment system is going to have the ability to adjust the girth. Again, this is what I think is the most valuable feature of a quilt, is the ability to adjust its girth. And so for the REI Magma system, I can slide these toggles in to reduce the amount of girth in the quilt, or out to give me more room or for sleeping in warmer conditions. Now, in terms of rolling over without catching a draft, practice this, and you might want to practice this at home in your living room. But get inside the quilt and practice rolling over from side to side without turning the quilt. Now, when you're in a mummy bag, that's really hard to do because the mummy bag isn't fixed to the sleeping pad. And so when you roll over, the mummy bag rolls over with you. With a quilt, because it is affixed to the sleeping pad, it's much easier to roll around inside it without turning the quilt over or causing the sides to open up and allow drafts to come in and out. Okay, Chad Brad from Instagram writes, when is a quilt not preferable to a bag? Personally, I prefer a mummy bag when I know the nights are going to be consistently cold as they are in winter conditions. So in general, I use a quilt down to 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll switch to a mummy bag for nights colder than that. There's something about cozying up inside a mummy bag and putting a hood over your head and pulling that drawstring tight so there's just a little tiny hole for your nose and mouth to breathe through. That's very comforting on a cold winter night. But everybody's different, and I know a lot of people who successfully use a quilt in winter conditions well down to 0 or even below. Okay, the next question comes from Garrett Martin on Instagram, and he writes, where can I buy a quilt in Canada? I don't want to pay ridiculous duty fees. I'm sorry you have to pay those duty fees. I know your options are limited in Canada, but recently MEC just started carrying the new Thermarest line of quilts that includes the Vesper quilt. These are really high-end, excellent products. Check out our review of the Vesper quilt here. I'll link that in the video description as well. But again, check out MEC and write to your, what do they call him, congressman? And maybe send a letter to Trudeau and talk to him about the tariffs. Okay, NK Irie writes on Instagram, why does anyone still use a mummy bag? My DIY quilt was a nightmare to make, but is easily my favorite piece of gear. First of all, good on you for making your own quilt. This is a huge project, especially if you're using down for your insulation. And yeah, it can be a nightmare with a lot of cleanup involved. But the answer is quite simple. Quilts are still considered sort of fringe. You do not see them in outdoor retail shops very much. There's only a handful of manufacturers that are making them at a scale that can be distributed through outdoor specialty retail. So when you walk into your favorite outdoor gear store, the default is still going to be a mummy bag, and the chance that you'll find a quilt on the shelf is pretty low. In addition, there's a degree of skill that's required to learning how to use a quilt effectively, and sometimes that's hard to sell in a retail shop, or it's hard to communicate to consumers. As with any lightweight gear, if there is some education involved in order to use it effectively, and we have a difficult time getting that education to the consumer, then consumers who don't have the skills might buy this gear, such as a quilt, try it out in the field, get frustrated with it, and then tell all their friends how terrible of a piece of gear it is. So again, it comes down to education, and it's easier to sell products that don't require a lot of education. But hopefully, some of you who don't yet have the skills or experience using a quilt will see this video and learn something and maybe try a quilt for yourself. Okay, BT Kilborn from Instagram writes, what are the benefits of a differential cut? Okay, on a mummy bag, a differential cut just means that the outer shell of fabric is cut larger than the inside lining of the fabric. So you've got two ellipses, one for the inside, one for the outside, and in between those ellipses are the baffles, and that's where your insulation is. So a differential cut allows somebody to get inside the quilt and compress the inner layer of fabric without compressing the baffles. So it's a way to maintain consistent insulation all the way around, even when you have pokey things like shoulders and hips. A differential cut is most commonly used on bags made for colder weather. A differential cut is less important for quilts and bags made for warmer weather. So you don't see this as often on quilts unless they're rated down to 20 degrees or colder. I've used quilts in the 30 to 40 degree range with a differential cut. I don't think it's necessary. If I was buying a quilt today that had a temperature rating of 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, I might think more seriously about wanting a differential cut. P. Winks from Instagram writes, vertical versus horizontal baffles. The origin of horizontal baffles came from sleeping bags. And so the idea of horizontal baffle is one that's oriented perpendicular to the length of your body. And the whole purpose of it is to allow the down to shift away from the center of the body towards the bag on warmer nights. And then on colder nights, you could kind of fluff that down more towards the top of the sleeping bag to give you more insulation. Personally, I find that feature most necessary only in extreme winter bags. So bags that are rated for temperatures of 10 degrees or less Fahrenheit. And the reason I like the ability to shift down in those bags is because even on a winter expedition, sometimes we'll have nights that are fairly warm, and I still want to stay zipped up in my bag, but I don't need all that insulation, and a bag that's too warm is just really uncomfortable. So the quilt I have here is a mix. There's vertical baffles across the top and horizontal baffles down at the bottom. The idea with vertical baffles is that because down can't shift side to side, it's not going to fall down around the side of your body if you don't want it to. Where vertical baffles, the down tends to stay in place more. Now in this quilt, horizontal baffles are used in the lower end, which makes sense because down at your legs, there's less of a drop off for down to fall down out of the baffles. Now after investigating a whole bunch of different quilts and sleeping bags, I've come to the conclusion that if a down chamber is properly filled with enough down, you're not going to have down migration whether you're using horizontal or vertical baffles. So I think it's more important for you to look at the manufacturer's reputation and how much fill weight is in the quilt. You'll be able to see if there's enough down in your baffles because they'll be slightly puffy between the baffle seams. If you see a baffle that's flat or even concave a little bit, send it back to the manufacturer. It does not have enough down in it. And there's going to be a high likelihood that because there's not enough down in that baffle, it's going to migrate and cause cold spots, whether you have a vertical baffle or a horizontal baffle. Okay, David62 from YouTube writes, what's the best, if any, quilt for under $200? If all you have is $200 to spend and you want the highest quality possible, you can make your own. There's a whole bunch of do-it-yourself, make your own gear quilt projects documented online. Do a search for them and take a look. You can get premium materials and premium downfill from some of the hammock gear companies and from fabric suppliers like Ripstop by the Roll. And I'll provide a link to those guys up here and down in the video description. You'll be able to make a very high performance quilt for $200 that would cost you probably $400 to $500 on the cottage market. Now, in terms of a ready-made quilt for under $200, the only one I know of that I would recommend is made by Hammock Gear. It uses a little bit heavier fabrics, a little bit lower quality down. So for the weight, you're not going to get as much performance as you're going to get if you spent $300 or $400, but it would be a good entry-level quilt if you wanted to try it out. Julian from YouTube writes, what's the difference between overfill and just getting the next lower temperature rating? The purpose of overfill is twofold. One, it's to keep down from shifting inside the baffle. Two, it provides some buffer against loft degradation in response to moisture absorption, which is something to consider if you are using a quilt for multi-day trips in wet and humid environments. But what you're doing with overfill is adding more puffiness to the middle of the baffle, even though the thickness between the baffles is going to remain fixed. So going to a higher temperature rating usually means going to a thicker baffle, which ultimately will make for a warmer quilt. So if you're looking for a warmer quilt, go to a higher temperature rating. If you're looking for a quilt that resists down shifting inside the baffle, or you're going to be hiking in wetter conditions, go for overfill. These are really good questions. Chad Brow from YouTube writes, I'm a side sleeper and toss and turn all night. Is a quilt right for me? Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think a quilt is a much better option for side sleepers than a mummy sleeping bag because it doesn't get twisted up around your body when you're rolling around. If you are a side sleeper and you have the option to purchase a custom quilt or an aftermarket quilt that might come in a larger width, go for a larger width. That will provide enough girth for the quilt to curl around your sides so that you're not compressing insulation with your shoulders and hips. Okay, that's it. Those were some great questions. Thank you for submitting them. I hope this video was valuable. If you'd like to learn more about quilts, make sure you visit our article about unconventional sleep systems. It's one of the most popular articles we've ever published at Backpacking Light. and it can provide you with lots of value if you're considering or you're practicing using a quilt for your backcountry endeavors. Thank you for watching this video. If you found some value in it, please hit the like button. It helps other people find the video if they're searching for information about quilts. And if you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button so that you can see more of what we have to offer. In addition, this video is advertising free. Our goal is to maintain that in all of these YouTube videos, and the way for you to do that is to consider becoming a Backpacking Light member. Thanks for watching and sleep well.